The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining the iOS Native Mobile Accessibility webinar by Deque Systems. Our presenter, Chris McMeeking, will be presenting. We're going to start a little bit after 2 p.m., so just sit tight while we wait for everyone to join the webinar. Hey everyone, Laura Goslin here from Deque, the event manager and marketing assistant. We're just waiting a few more minutes. It's now 2 p.m. We're just going to wait for a couple more minutes to make sure that everyone can hop on before we begin the webinar. Hey everyone, it's now 2 minutes after 2 p.m. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks again for joining this webinar. It's the iOS Mobile Accessibility webinar presented by our Deque expert on Android and iOS, Chris McMeeking. Just some quick housekeeping things before we get started. If you are in need of captions, they are posted in the chat box on the GoToWebinar control panel. They were also, there was a link to the captions sent out in the original email that had the login information for the webinar. If you have a question, please keep that until the end. You can post that also in the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel. Please be sure, though, if you're referring to a specific slide, please include the slide number with that. And with those things out of the way, I'm now going to pass things over to our presenter, Chris McMeeking.
Hello, Laura. Am I coming in clear?
Yep, you're all good.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris McMeeking. As Laura said, I'm a senior software engineer here at Deque. I own all of our native mobile accessibility testing products. Also a member of the W3C Mobile Accessibility Task Force, helping define mobile concerns for what WCAG 2.1 is moving forward. and Chris CM on Stack Overflow. If you have any development tech-specific questions about how to accomplish things, if you tag them with VoiceOver, iOS, Android, TalkBack are all tags that I watch very actively. Guaranteed to see the question, don't always have time to answer, but that's a good way to get my attention. And with that, let's begin the webinar. So let's do a quick overview of the stuff that we're going to cover today. This is going to look very similar if you were in my Android webinar. We're going to cover very similar topics just from an iOS point of view. But the big picture is implementing accessibility is easy. When you're talking about interacting with the APIs on iOS, the interfaces and things that Apple gives you are really straightforward. But getting it right is the difficult part. Users, when you're talking about a blind user or a physically disabled user and the difficulties that they have interacting with these assistive technologies, that they're not often the difficulties that developers have when using assistive technologies, because we don't use them, we're not familiar with them. And so knowing what to do is difficult, and in particular, knowing what not to do. The frustrations a developer has using a voiceover in an application are going to be different than the frustrations someone familiar with VoiceOver has using an application. And so when you're thinking of the user in this context, you got to remember that these users are very familiar with the assistive technology and how they work. And so don't project your difficulties with VoiceOver onto a blind person's difficulties using VoiceOver, because they're often going to be very, very different. And so knowing what to do and knowing what not to do is hard. Itinerary, so we're going to talk about applying WCAG 2.0 to iOS. WCAG 2.0, their guidelines, their things, you know, that thing that I just said, how projecting a developer's difficulties within assistive technology versus the actual difficulties. WCAG 2.0 can only help you answer those questions. The iOS accessibility ecosystem. What assistive technologies are available? What are the public interfaces that you have to interact with those technologies, so on and so forth. API demos. I have some stage examples. One of the things that I'm going to say is I usually like to demo these live with VoiceOver, but it's very difficult to do that across the wire in a way that's understandable. So what I've done is I've marked them up on the slides, and you'll see what I mean when I get to those demos. And then also advanced APIs and demos from apps in the wild. I really want to get to the advanced APIs and the demos from apps in the wild. I'll cover if we have time. And I can't cover everything, so if I miss something, ask a question or feel free to reach out with a question to Laura after the webinar. So let's talk about WCAG 2.0 and how it maps to a mobile environment and mobile-specific considerations. Screen size. It's important to remember that when you're dealing with mobile devices, we have to deal with things on a smaller screen, and so create layouts that are user-friendly. And remember that not everyone is going to be able to understand everything within the concept of those screen size, so we have to take into account Zoom assistive technologies. Zoom assistive technologies are available on desktop as well, but they're really, really commonly used on mobile devices, especially dynamic type sizing. Dynamic type sizing basically allows you to control the font, make sure that your layouts and such respond to dynamic type sizing, and focus control. Focus control is often handled poorly, particularly in native mobile environments. When you're on a desktop and dealing with the desktop assistive technology, you're almost always gonna be talking about keyboard users when you're talking about focus control. Whereas in iOS, you have this separation of accessibility focus and input focus that happens more frequently. And so focus control is really important, and understanding the difference between input focus and accessibility focus. WCAG 2.0 operable considerations with mobile operating systems. Again, input focus and accessibility focus, understanding the difference between those two things is really important. Gestures. One of the things that mobile devices allow you to do is they allow you to interact directly with this screen, and there's this tendency to want to do cool things with gestures. Like when you swipe back and forth, it does cool things, and if you do a curly Q gesture on the screen, it's some shortcut for some action. when VoiceOver interacts, or say a switch call, or anyone who's using an assistive technology isn't necessarily going to be able to do those gestures. And so we want to make sure that there's alternative ways of performing those things. And some things like device manipulation, sometimes those are things that are just specific to that, like, so let's say a game where you're tilting the device and you're relying on the gyroscopes to like balance a ball in the middle of the screen. There is no way to supply that functionality alternatively. So sometimes the device manipulation is required as the feature of the thing, and that's okay. But what you want to avoid is things like shaking the device that creates some type of action and have that action not be available elsewhere, right? Touch target size. Things need a minimum size. Your finger is the clicker, and I mean, I don't know about you guys, I have pretty fat fingers. Even tapping some links in the App Store, in Apple's App Store app, get pretty difficult sometimes. Understandable. Screen orientation is a really important consideration on mobile. You have to remember that users with disabilities are frequently going to have, especially physical disabilities, are going to have devices that are mounted in front of them. And if you have an application that is required to be in portrait layout and someone has their device mounted in front of them in landscape layout, that application is completely inaccessible. So when it comes to the base product, unless the orientation of your thing is required for its functionality, you have to support different orientations, at least 100 degrees of support. Although once you're supporting 180 degrees, the 270, you know, like the difference between right and left, nobody's going to mount their device upside down, but at least you should be able to tilt it right, you should be able to tilt it left. And maintaining consistent layout, given different sizes and orientations, is important, although ultimately a best practice. Robustness. Robustness is a really important category when it comes to native mobile development, because robustness helps you create maintainable code. I will talk more about this throughout the presentation and how it applies to specific APIs, but basically what robustness means to me in a native environment is doing things the way the operating system would want you to do them and embracing the behavioral characteristics of the operating system. Let's talk about this, what do I have on the slide here? So software keyboards can change layout. When you're talking about keyboard type, it's important to remember that there is a difference between a password keyboard and a normal keyboard. The automatic capitalization of a letter from a normal keyboard is going to be frustrating to a user who doesn't know they just automatically added a capital letter to their password. Right. So conversely, you know, simple like a number pad and thing, getting the keyboard type right is important. And like I said, support the characteristics of the platform. A lot of times on Stack Overflow, and when I'm answering questions about this, I'll see users trying to do things with the APIs that they are not supported, and I will talk about that specifically for those APIs when I get there. But basically what it comes down to is if you're including the information the way the operating system wants you to include the information, it will work well across devices and device versions. This isn't as complicated of a problem as it is on Android, because iOS has control of their devices. They sell all the same devices. They're all very similar, but we're still concerned about different versions of the iOS platform, and we still want to make sure we do things the way iOS users want them done. That way, when things like the handling of traits change or the handling of labels change, they change universally and change the way an iOS 7 user wants them versus an iOS 8 user versus an iOS 9 user. And if you want to read more about this mapping stuff, it's available on www.w3.org/tr/mobile accessibility mapping. Lots of great information there. I certainly did not cover it all. I want to get onto technical details. So the iOS accessibility ecosystem, assistive technologies, VoiceOver is going to be your primary concern. That is the most widely used assistive technology, is the primary AT for the platform. It's also the one that's most supported, is the most up to date, is the most stable. But you also have switch control, zoom, dynamic type sizing, and a bunch of other accessibility options like the ability to change colors and all sorts of cool stuff. Alternative input, keyboards, braille boards. A common question I get regarding assistive technologies is, do I have to test for all of them? And the answer is no. You don't have to test for all of them because a lot of the APIs are going to overlap. For example, when you're talking about keyboard interaction and VoiceOver. Those two things you probably has to test for. But once you've tested keyboard interaction, you've probably tested most of the things that a Braille board is going to do. Once you've tested switch control, you've probably tested a lot of the things that VoiceOver is going to do. So a lot of these things overlap. A good coverage is going to be, you got to make sure your dynamic type sizing works. You got to make sure your switch control works. You got to make sure VoiceOver works, and you should check one alternative input mechanism. And if you do that, you're going to have really, really good broad coverage. APIs, let's cover the APIs. They're simple in what the properties tell you, but they're not as simple as you might think to get them correct. Especially the UI accessibility protocol, which is things like accessibility labels, hints, so on and so forth. UI accessibility container protocol is kind of more advanced, allows you to control what things do and how different groupings of things are presented. And then there's UI accessibility notifications, which deals with dynamic elements on screen, and so on and so forth. One of the tools you have available is the iOS Accessibility Inspector, and I want to do a short demo of that. So when we're talking about the Accessibility Inspector, it's important to note that it's heavily linked with what you see coming from VoiceOver. So what we have here is we have this focus rectangle here, right? And as I'm going and as I'm focusing things, so I'm using this within the context of a browser, but you can also use this with an iOS simulator or whatever you have in the background. And we have this green focus rectangle show up. And if I were using VoiceOver in an iOS environment, this green rectangle would represent what I was focusing in VoiceOver, and it gives me the title here, like Agora. That's the accessibility label, right? Or the type button. That's going to be the trait, right? It gives me that information. Really important to note that this green rectangle that I have focused is the thing that VoiceOver would focus. Here, VoiceOver in a desktop environment, on in an iOS environment is going to be the same thing, right? Because you're going to see that green focus rectangle in my slides on some of my examples. All right, so let's talk about the UI accessibility protocol. So there's a lot of different properties of the UI. Oops, sorry, I have this focus rectangle sticking around. I want to get rid of it real quick. Perfect. My accessibility inspector was being obnoxious. All right, so the UI accessibility protocol. There's a lot of properties in the UI accessibility protocol. We're going to talk about two sets. We're going to talk about basic ones, accessibility labels. If you're familiar with the robustness protocol, there's this idea in accessibility of name, role, and value of a thing. Name being a simple description, value being things like state or the number of a thing, and the role being, is it a switch, is it a link, is it a button, name, role, and value. The accessibility label is normally going to be the name of the thing. It can represent the state or the value, but it should not contain role information. The accessibility hint is frequently unnecessary. I would say that anytime the accessibility label contains the name of the thing, the accessibility hint is frequently going to be additional information. But if the label is the thing that is controlling the state or the value of the thing, then a hint is a really sensible place to put the name of the thing. And I'll go over that example in detail in just a little bit. Accessibility traits communicate role information to the user. They communicate what the thing is. And there are a lot of roles that don't exist within the traits. There are a lot of roles that iOS will attempt to calculate programmatically, and that's okay. We should embrace the operating systems wanting to do that. But accessibility traits just change the way VoiceOver interacts with control and communicate information to the user. There's two categories. Also, final note, when you're talking about labels and hints, consider the case and punctuation of your labels and hints. It changes the way VoiceOver announces your control. Adding exclamations or periods to the end of things, capital letters at the beginning, helps VoiceOver read things in a more natural way. All right, so with all of that being said, let's dissect a VoiceOver announcement. So remember that green focus thing that I was talking about when I brought up the accessibility inspector. That's what we have here, right? And so VoiceOver, it's difficult for me to share the screen content. I actually have to hold my phone up here. So what I've done is I've said, here's this green focus thing. This is what VoiceOver would focus. And I've added the announcement to this flag. So when we focus this control, we get increment, button, there's a pause, and then add one to tomato. And so what we have here is we have increment is the accessibility label. Button, the announcement of button comes from the fact that we've added the UI accessibility trait button to it. And add one to tomato is the accessibility hint. That is that hint information. And notice, so remember in the screen before, what I said was we can use the hint to contain the name information. In this case, the accessibility label is increment. The accessibility label is the not value, but it's what the thing is doing, right? The button, it's a button. We need to tell it what we're incrementing, which is the name of the thing, right? So we have add one to tomato. We need to associate it with that name. There's kind of two names. There's the increment name and then there's the tomato name, and those two things need to be associated. Picture this increment decrement thing within a series of, all right, so we're incrementing tomatoes. So we have an increment button for tomatoes. We have an increment button for beans. We have an increment button for potatoes. And you need to know what the thing is that you're incrementing. And it's really sensible to store that information in the hint. So let's talk about all of the accessibility traits that we have access to. Button link image, that's just going to cause literally add the announcement of button link and image to those things. And in this case, remember I said we're going to separate traits into two categories. Here we're talking about the things that change the role of the thing. Selected, it's going to announce as selected. Unlike these things above, selected is actually going to announce first. It's going to say, so here, one of these is going to be like a puppy button or a cat button. This is going to say selected first. It's going to say selected cat. Not enabled is going to announce as dimmed. You use that for things that you're temporarily disabling. Static text is a really interesting one. This is actually going to hide an announcement. So if you have a UI text field where somebody would enter text in it, but you've hacked the UI text field to just present some static text, you can cause a UI text field to announce as a UI label. So instead of saying, hey, this is editable, whatever, blah, 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 it'll just announce exactly like a UI label. And it's actually funny because you'll see static text trait applied to things like UI labels. That's completely useless. It only changes the announcement of a UI text field. Header announces as a heading and brings us to our accessibility traits. I will go back to this slide, I promise. My slides are out of order by one. Let's talk about the behavioral traits real quick. So header becomes a navigation landmark. So what it allows you to do is it allows you to navigate to things. Instead of navigating by single controls, you can navigate to things by headers. Headers are really important. Summary elements on the traits, share information on view controller load or new view presentation. Don't overuse this trait. Adjustable says that the thing can be changed. It changes the way it interacts with it so that when you're on one of those controls, you can swipe up and down and modify the value of the thing without actually interacting with the control directly. Think of like a volume control or something like that. Allows direct interaction is going to pass screen gestures directly through to the view. Think like a signature field, right? You have an area where the user needs to be able to draw their signature on a view. This is where you would use something like that. Do not overuse that property as well. If you can really easily take that and completely break the accessibility of your application by applying it to too global of a view. Updates frequently. Don't announce every change to this thing. If you have like a counter of some kind that's changing by second, eventually the very announcement is going to be longer than it takes. If it's updating more frequently than it takes for the distance, for the length of the announcement, you're going to end up with announcements that step on each other's toes, and you're going to have this long string of announcements that stacks up. Updates frequently is just going to announce it every time you have a pause in the announcement. So like, let's say you're counting to 1, 2, 3, 4, it'll say like 1, and then it might say 4, and then it might say, depending on how long it takes to get to announcement. Don't let me interrupt other announcements. Play sound is going to do very similar things, but just in reverse. All right, so let's go back to this dissecting of VoiceOver announcement thing. And remember the screen back here where I had this increment control that has button add 1 tomato. Look at this little, oops, I went too far back. Look at this little thing here. So notice we have 0 tomatoes right now. And so we've dimmed, we've disabled this little minus control because we can't have less than 0 tomatoes, right? And so notice the announcement here, decrement dimmed button. We got the pause, and then we announce the hint, remove 1 tomato. It doesn't make sense to remove a tomato from 0, so we're announcing as dimmed. And the only thing that's changed here is we've added this UI accessibility trait not enabled, and that's what's causing that announcement of dimmed. And so, and that is how a user, an iOS user would expect a disabled control to be announced, is to have it announced as dim, given this trait. All right. The last kind of basic property is accessibility element, allows us to control what is focusable by assistive technology. So if it's yes, the element is focusable. If it's no, the element is not focusable. Pretty straightforward, but there are some caveats. All right, so we have a view here that has 2 buttons, and I'm saying that it's broken. The reason it's broken, let's go over. So we have this not focusable button and the not focusable button. What we've done here is send, so the first button is an accessibility element. The second button is an accessibility element. They share the same super view, and that super view is an accessibility element. And what happens is we can only focus that super view. If we were to go in here and swipe right or hit tab or whatever, we're not going to be able to focus these 2 buttons. VoiceOver is going to skip them, and since those are buttons, it's going to activate the middle point, which is going to be nothing. So actually, in this particular case, neither of these is going to be actionable. And so what we want is to get rid of that. We don't want the super view to be accessible, or what we want to do is use the UIAccessibilityContainer protocol to focus these individually. Really, in this case, it's just easier to say that the super view is not an accessibility element. UI accessibility protocol others. So there are some other properties that I want to talk about real quick. Accessibility frame, you can control the focus rectangle. You don't actually have to have the focus rectangle be what the focus rectangle is, what the actual view rectangle is. You can make it bigger, right? Which allows you to do cool things like take a switch and have it wrap over its visible label. Apple uses that all the time in their design idioms, the idea of wrapping 2 controls together into 1 control. And when you couple this with the accessibility activation point, remember that the VoiceOver by default is going to activate the middle of your accessibility frame. If you couple this with the accessibility activation point, you can do really powerful things with grouping active controls with their visible labels. And you can do them really simply. You just say, hey, let this control encapsulate this entire thing and activate the point where the active control is. Really easy idiom for grouping information with active controls. Accessibility navigation style. This is specific to switch access or switch control, and it allows you to do control grouping. So if you're familiar with switch access or switch control, what's going to happen is you're going to scan over things, and you can control the way those things are grouped together to make it more efficient. If you have to scan over every control one at a time, it gets a little frustrating. You can do control groupings and scan over things in groups much faster. View is modal says don't focus things outside of this container. Don't focus sibling containers of this thing. That's useful for modal dialogues. You can hide accessibility elements, all of the accessibility elements within a dialogue. If your thing is invisible for a period of time, you can say hide all of these things. You can group children, and there's a lot of other little properties. I've covered the important ones. UI accessibility notifications. So this is a separate API from the UI accessibility protocol. It allows us to do cool things with dynamic elements. What you're going to do is there are 2 types of accessibility notifications. there are those that you send from your application, and there are those that you listen to from UIKit to your application. So basically what you do is you say UI accessibility post notification, and then the name of the notification and an argument. So let's dissect the screen change notification. It's the most complicated of the ones that you are expected to send. When you send a screen change notification with an argument, what's going to happen is it's going to play the bleep bloop sound. That's the thing that tells the user that the screen has changed. If your argument is a string, it's going to announce the string. If your argument is a view within the view hierarchy, it will focus that and then it will announce it. And actually with screen change, you can supply a null argument, which is going to focus the first view in the hierarchy that isn't a system view, and then behave just like providing a view argument. It will focus it and then it will announce it. Layout changed, same as above, no bleep bloop sound. It's only part of your layout has changed. It's not going to play the screen changed bleep bloop sound. An announcement is going to behave the same, except it's just you can only supply the announcement. You can only supply an argument of string. Ultimately, you could use UI accessibility layout change to accomplish the same thing as announcement, and nothing is different. There's speculation even within the Apple developer docs that this will force some type of re-rendering for VoiceOver. I've never actually seen an example where calling layout changed or not calling layout changed changes the way VoiceOver behaves. I would love if somebody would show that to me if it exists, but I don't think that it does. I have tested with the UI accessibility container protocol extensively and have never seen any of that behavior. So don't worry if you're not posting these notifications. They only change, they only, they only control where focus is and control announcements. They're not required to call them as a part of anything. Your VoiceOver will still work even if you're not using them. All right, so let's talk about the notifications that you can listen for. There's a lot of them. Most of them I don't like. I think when you're talking about notifications that you're listening for, there's a lot of edge cases, and there's a lot of things that I think really you got to rethink your design if you're listening to those notifications. But some of them are edge cases, but they're really far edge cases that I don't think are worth digging into. Element focused. So when a new element receives accessibility focus, you can know that it's received focus. That's valuable for tracking where focus is within your application, especially if you have things like where you're going to be tempted to post those UI accessibility screen change notifications or layout change notifications. Knowing where focus is, it is important because you may want to put focus back onto a similar element if the screen has changed or if the layout has changed. You want to know where focus is, so if you haven't removed that content, you can put focus back onto that content. Announcement did finish. If you posted an announcement of some kind from one of those notifications that we talked about, you can know that it's done. And like I said, there are a lot of other notifications you can listen for. They're pretty edge casey in their uses and you can dig into those on your own. All right, so UI Accessibility Container Protocol. This allows you to control the way your containers are interacted with, to control. So the common use case, for example, would be a custom control that doesn't have its own views in it. You can create custom accessibility elements and control the way that they're interacted with. And to do that, you just say, this is how many accessibility elements are in my view. This is how you get the accessibility at a specific index. This is the index of that element, and these are accessibility elements. And you can use this to create custom controls and customize the way VoiceOver interacts with your application. You can also use it. So one of the things that's cool is all of these properties, VoiceOver, the way VoiceOver pings all of these properties is it's calling these functions constantly. So if you're curious about the way VoiceOver is interacting with your application or the way VoiceOver is interacting with your controls, you can apply these properties to them, let them be default things like have element count just be the number of children in the view, return that, but then you can log in from information from that call to see how all of these things are working. And like I said back in my disclaimer about the UI layout change notifications and stuff, you can really glean a lot of information about the way the accessibility protocols and stuff work by logging things from these properties. And so now I got about 10 minutes left. What I want to do is poke around a few applications in VoiceOver and show you what some of this stuff is doing. So I have my AirPlay set up. And let's look at the accessibility of a few apps. And where did my AirPlay server go? All right. All right, and come down here. There we go. All right, so this is AirPlay server. This is, you are looking at me interacting with, this is actually the App Store. And so what I'm doing is I have VoiceOver and I'm swiping right. And when it comes to an announcement, I will help announce it for you. So let's focus one of these things. Notice here, one of the things that I said about VoiceOver is you can collect things, you can collect views. Notice how we've wrapped this entire view in one accessible object, right? This is good. We've associated this data together. There's a lot of different data points in here that would need collected together. But hold on, let me switch. So we have all of these views that need collected together. Like, so for example, this rating star, right? This rating star, this rating belongs to this particular review is important information to collect, right? Because if we have 40 hours ago, Friday, these two things, it's not apparent whether this is associated with this one or this one, right? There's some ordering issues. If you were to focus these individually, there's ordering issues. Is this heading here belong up here, or does this heading belong down here, right? And so what they've done is they've removed that concern. They've grouped all of this information together, which is great. All of this information is grouped together. We know where it belongs, and there's only one actionable thing here. This grouping is really, really good. Now, that being said, we can, let's see if we can find, I found the example. So what happens is if you have one of these rectangles, and I can't find the example of it. I want to get to the more reviews, or maybe let's go look at a different, application. Stranger reviews selected. Related rating best good best game great awesome. Let's try here we go. So this is interesting. So here we have the same grouping going on, but we have multiple actors. So notice they've separated this, right? Apple's doing another smart thing here. So we have two actual controls. So there's data that we want to associate it here, right? We have the cost of the thing, and we have the name of the thing over here to the left, right? But this thing over here to the left is actionable. When I activate it, it's going to do a separate thing than the price is going to do, right? So what happens is we have to focus those two things separately. We can't wrap these two things into one container because there are two actionable things here. So what we have to do is we have to create that association, this association where I'm paying $7.99. I need to know that I'm paying $7.99 for NBA 2K18 games, not $7.99 for Plague Incorporated. Right? And so what we have to do is we have to associate that differently because we have an actionable thing to the left and an actionable thing to the right. Those have to be focusable individually. And in this case, what they've done is, I can't hold the announcement up to you, but basically there's a hint that reads out afterwards that says, hey, this is the thing that, the proper way to do that would be having the hint that reads out afterwards that says $7.99, pay for NBA 2K18 games. That's the way that you should mark this up, creating that association through the hint. And then what happens is developers, power users of your application, right? Because there's two different types of data that we have. We have that data that we want right away. We don't want to wait for the fact that this is $7.99. We know that's the new information here. By placing that associating data, by saying $7.99 for NBA 2K18 games, users that are familiar with your application don't have to wait for that pause. They'll get used to the fact that this is a list of costs with games, right? They'll know that, they'll understand that, and they will learn to know that the cost is to the right. and they'll know, all right, I'm going down this list, I'm swiping quick. Oh, this is $7.99. I don't need to wait for the NBA 2K18 hint. I know that the cost is to the right, and that's where it belongs because I've used this application before. So you can program by putting that information in the hint. You've separated power users and standard users of VoiceOver. Power users are going to know that what it's for, that it's for the thing to the left, right? That is all of the information I had. Oh, my air server just died. Perfect timing. It's like I did that on purpose. I would like to know if you guys have any questions. But thank you for listening. Don't forget, I am on Stack Overflow. If you, like I say, if you tag things with VoiceOver, TalkBack, Android, iOS, accessibility, I will guaranteed read those questions. Whether or not I have time to answer them is questionable. And also Native Mobile DQ blog, we're starting these series of vlog videos where I do much like I did today here on the webinar, but more technical, really specific chunks of information in about 5-minute snippets, and then write a blog post down the bottom emphasizing the important parts, adding time slots to connect to spots in those videos, so on and so forth, about how to implement really specific things. For example, how to implement those groupings that you saw today in VoiceOver, how to implement that in a really easy, accessible way, how to implement the idea of activation points so that you can group active controls with some informative content, grouping together, so on and so forth. All of that information is stuff that I have coming up. Showing you how to do that is planned in this blog. But that is all I had, and I am ready for questions.
Great, thanks, Chris. Got a question here from SK asking, where do you find the accessibility inspector that you were demonstrating?
Perfect. Yeah, I did rush through that part a little bit, so let me show you. Let me bring this down here. So here is Xcode. This is my Xcode environment. You go up here, Xcode, Open Developer Tool, Accessibility Inspector, and that opens up this window here. And you can use this. So when you're connected over here, you can use this if you, so you can analyze Finder. You can connect it to any process you have running, including the simulator. And actually, if you have a device connected to your computer, an iOS device connected to your computer, you can actually connect it to your iOS device as well. Now, an important thing to point out about the Accessibility Inspector is it is sharing these in when you're looking at an iOS application, it's sharing these with modified kind of fake desktop versions of them. So you're not going to get all of the properties that you get from iOS. You're going to get desktop formatted versions of those properties, but it's still really, really useful. Just don't take all of its information to heart. Sometimes you're going to get slightly misleading information from this in an iOS environment. So when you're looking at the iOS simulator, that information, it'll be misleading sometimes. For example, traits, some of the traits informations don't come over 100%.
Got it. Okay, I have another one here. Explain emulation and why VoiceOver on iPhone is not captioned.
Why VoiceOver on iPhone is not captioned. And emulation. I guess I don't really understand what I feel like if I were to answer that question right now, I might be interpreting the question wrong. But that because VoiceOver. So for example, the reason I'm misunderstanding the question, when you say VoiceOver and emulation, there is no VoiceOver on the simulator or the emulator. There's a actually reasonable line distinction between what simulation versus emulation is even doing. And so when you're talking about captioning of something, as in supplying text strings for the words, that's just an option that they decided to omit. When VoiceOver delivers strings of text to the text-to-speech engine, it delivers those as strings. There's no reason that information can't be supplied somewhere. Although again, how that links to the simulator or emulator voices versus an actual iOS device, I'm not clear on that question, so you'll have to clarify. Maybe that's a good thing to get an email about. If you send emails to Laura, she can pass them through to me. I just need more details there.
Great. So another one here. Is there API functionality for the use of color contrast ratio?
Is there API functionality for the use of color contrast ratio? So there is no API that will allow you to easily calculate the color contrast of two things. I do have that built into our native mobile accessibility testing stuff. That's a test for iOS. But as for like APIs that allow you to do that, basically you have to capture the color of the thing and calculate that yourself. There's a lot of weird things to do with alpha blending and default alpha states of backgrounds that get all the way back to whether or not your main view is opaque or not, and a lot of weird considerations there. I definitely don't recommend you doing that by yourself. You should definitely check out a test for iOS to do that. But there are APIs that allow you to change things or respond to changes in color. So if we go here, UI accessibility, and that's actually some of those notifications that I did not look at. Oh, no, that's not the, let's see. Trying to find UI accessibility notification names. I hate Apple's documentation on this. It's very difficult to navigate. Notification dictionary. Here we go. Oh, these aren't even all of the notifications. Where? UI accessibility notification. Nope, it's hard to find. If you go to the list of UI accessibility notifications, you will find things in there like the ability to respond to darker colors and the ability to respond to inverted colors. Those are some of those notifications that I didn't listen to. And what that allows you to do is if someone is asking for darker colors, you can make those darker color changes more dramatic than the default system properties. If you like, let's say that you have a pair of colors that don't invert well, you can manually supply the inverted colors for those. So those allow you to interact with things that control color contrast, but no, there is no property that allows you to say, hey, does this have color contrast, or even what is the color contrast of my thing? In fact, there's a lot of different ways of calculating color contrast. I don't even think the world agrees on what the color contrast calculation should be. When I say color contrast calculation, I refer to the luminance calculation as supplied by the W3C in WCAG 2.0. And no, there is no API to do that.
We have another question here from Joanna asking, when you were opening up the accessibility inspector, there seemed to be another option called demo. What is that? Is that part of Xcode? Is that used to demo accessibility support at all?
There's another option called demo. I am not sure. Within the realm of the accessibility inspector, I'm not sure what it is that that question is referring to. If there's a slide or specific spot that the word demo pops up, would be happy to answer, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that question is asking exactly.
Okay, we'll move on. In the App Store view, would the app name, photo, and rating VoiceOver at the same time since they were grouped together?
Yes, that's a good question. So let me. So I have my headphones on. Let me take my headphones off real quick. Actually, just partially. All right. So I am bringing up my. All right. So I have my AirPlay server with my device on, and so I believe the question is so the App Store. So we have this. Control grouping here, right? And so the question is, does it announce just the picture? Does it announce everything? So what you want to do when you do this, and so I'm going to give what the correct answer is. I actually can't hear VoiceOver. I have it turned all the way down so that it doesn't affect you guys too much. So basically what it should announce is what we want to do is we have informative information, right? We have this rectangle that is saying there is informative information within this rectangle, and we're also promising that there's only one active element. If there's more than one active element being focused at a time, that's always going to be an issue. But so we have informative information and one active control, and we want to announce all of that information. And I believe Apple gets this correct, right? But basically the information that we have here is one of some odd number. So we focus the first of something. Minecraft, this is decorational, actually, unless it includes some text. The image that represents is, oh no, I went too far. The image that this represents in this case is decorational. So we have Minecraft, we have games, we have 4 of 5 stars, 10,089, and I just turned it up and I'm listening to it in the background, and they do in fact get that right. But yes, you want to, anything that VoiceOver focus rectangle encompasses, you want to announce. And the reason I say that I actually say that for a really specific reason. When you're presenting information to VoiceOver, you have to keep in mind 2 users. You have a blind user who's gonna be confused by things like the grouping thing that I talked about, how we have this 699 in the ordering issue here, right? Does 699 apply to the game before it or the game after it? But then you also have the partially sighted user who is using VoiceOver just for the readout, right? They don't need the navigation help. They don't need the help activating things. They don't need the help finding these things on screen, but they need help understanding that maybe they can't read, or maybe they have difficulty reading because their vision is blurred, right? And so, but they can still see, like they can see this label here and they can see this label here. So if you have a focus rectangle encompassing all this information, but you omit this 5-star things and just say Minecraft, you're going to confuse a partially sighted user. And so what can happen is let's say that games was individually focusable, but we still have this focusable thing here. You're going to have these weird nested touch targets, and someone who is just poking around and exploring with touch to explore is going to have a really bad user experience doing something like touch to explore and then having it jump from Minecraft games just because their finger is touching just a slightly different thing, and they can actually see that happening, and that's going to be a really bad user experience for a partially sighted talkback user. So yes, we want all of the information that a VoiceOver rectangle encompasses, we want to share together because we're not just concerned about blind users, we're also concerned about partially sighted users and all sorts of other good reasons for grouping all of that information together.
Okay, so we have another one here from SK clarifying when he was referring to testing. He says it's for those who are deaf testing on iPhone. There are captions on MacBook VoiceOver, but not on the iPhone. And for TalkBack on Android, it is captioned. So trying to find a solution for that problem.
Yes. Yep. I understand. That is a good question. And actually, so one of the things I said at the beginning was that I find demoing on VoiceOver frustrating because I use that caption when I'm doing demos so that you can see what's being displayed. So yes, I share that frustration. It doesn't output on VoiceOver, but it will output to alternative devices like Braille boards. And I haven't actually thought of it in terms of this before, but I'm fairly certain you should just be able to like if you can have a Braille board device that will grab onto that information, you should also be able to hypothetically have some other type of technology that can just present that and display that information textually. Why that's not built into VoiceOver directly, that is a question for Apple and not for me.
Thanks, Chris. Another one here. Imagine you have a modal view. If you dismiss it, the VoiceOver focus always goes behind it in the same frame it has before. How can you move the focus at the right position you want? For example, at the beginning of the screen.
Yep. If we go back to my presentation, those notifications that you can send, from your app to the system, the screen change, oops, I started clicking expecting things to highlight. So the screen change to notification and the layout change to notification are what you want. The argument here is going to be the view that you want to move focus to. So you want to say UI accessibility post notification, layout change notification. So if what you have is a modal that's disappearing, I would say that the screen hasn't updated, right? The content that was behind that modal is still roughly the same. So you probably want to post the layout change notification. So you want to say UI accessibility post notification, UI accessibility layout change notification, and the view that you want to have focus. If that view is the first view, so just find that view, supply it, push off this notification. There are race conditions you can get. So if that behavior doesn't work, make sure that you're doing that at the right time. You don't want to post that notification as your modal is disappearing. You want to make sure you post that notification after your modal has completely gone. And yes, that may mean that focus goes somewhere arbitrary first, and you hear this partial announcement. That's a weakness of the APIs. But what I would say as a subnote to that is that in general, unless you have some type of custom modal, the behavior of a modal and where focus goes after a modal is dismissed is something that I would normally recommend just leaving alone. There may be something custom that you're doing or some other circumstance that's changing this assertion, but if you're doing modals the way iOS has you do modals, you should also let iOS determine where focus goes afterwards. Just those default behaviors, if you're doing something contrary to the way everyone else in the world is doing it, that is going to tend to be less accessible than perhaps the thing that you're reading from some set of standards or something else.
Okay.
That being said, if you're doing custom things, absolutely control it and push it somewhere and have that link up with the default VoiceOver iOS expectation.
Okay. I have another one here. How can you get VoiceOver to read accessibility traits like link throughout continuous reading?
Like link throughout continuous reading. I don't know what the extension of, so I assume when you say continuous reading, what you're meaning is the whole like VoiceOver is just reading all of the screen content. And my answer to that would be you absolutely should not get it to do that. The reason I say that is because to do so would require you to include that role information within the accessibility label, right? So the way you would fix that, the way you would do that is to include the word link within the accessibility label of thing, to add that role information to that thing. And you absolutely should not. Apple has, for whatever reason, decided that the link information should be omitted from the continuous anything. And basically what they're saying is all of the information on a continuous read is this, quote, informative information. The role of a thing, the hint of a thing doesn't matter. We're not reading out all of the properties. We're just going to read out thing. And when you think of that in terms of traits and hints, right, where you say, right, let's go back to this dissection of an accessibility announcement page, right? So what is not happening on a continuous read is we're not focusing all of them and saying decrement, dimmed, long pause, remove one tomato. That's not what a continuous read is. A continuous read is just saying, this is the information presented on this page, right? So Apple has said, hey, let's just go there and say decrement, increment, 0 tomatoes, number of beans, decrement, increment, right? The alternative would be number of tomatoes, decrement, dimmed, button, pause, wait, removed 1 tomato, increment, dimmed, pause, wait, add 1 tomato, right? That's not what the continuous read is doing. The continuous read is saying, here's the information, go in and scan these things. And so my answer is, how you would do it is you would include the link information in the accessibility label. You absolutely shouldn't do that and should drop that requirement.
Okay, another one here. iOS supports accessibility roles, but this is not supported in Android OS. What is the best way to handle roles in Android OS?
This is an iOS webinar. You should watch my Android webinar video, but basically I think I can't answer that in a cool Android iOS-y way. When you're looking at the way iOS does things in terms of accessibility, is they kind of steer you in these specific iOS ways of doing things, right? When you're looking at the difference between iOS and Android, iOS keeps you in this confined, safe environment, and they give you a lot of controls over these simple properties, right? What Android does, the Android philosophy is, let's give you a few really flexible properties and let you do whatever you want with them. And so in iOS, what you have is you have buttons, links, labels, and then it also plays that there's some secondary role information that plays in the idea of earcons, like the ability of, where it says like double tap to press. Well, anytime it says double tap to press, it's sharing the role of the thing, and that role is that it's actionable, right? And so in Android, what happens is they try to do a lot of stuff for you. They try to calculate the role of a thing. So the role is contained in the fact that you've used a button and that you used an Android.widget.button or an Android.widget.whatever. The role is the actual semantic class type of the thing. In iOS, what happens is they say, hey, we will supply defaults for that. So like in the interface builder, if you plop a button down, that button is going to automatically have the trait of a button supplied to it, right? But that doesn't keep you from removing that and using a button as a purely informative thing. You can have buttons that aren't actually active. Although if you're removing it temporarily, that should be dimmed. But if you permanently remove, if you're using a button just to present information, there's nothing keeping you from saying remove the accessibility trait of button, remove all of the actionable things that make a button actionable, and using it to present information. But that's just kind of the fundamental difference between iOS and Android. Is iOS is going to keep you in this bubble, and Android is going to say, hey, let's do as much for you automatically as we can. But if you want to go out and explore these super flexible APIs and just overwrite everything with a content description, you can. You shouldn't, but you can.
Okay, have the simulator VoiceOver, or sorry, we're going to skip to another one. If you don't announce a link, how does the user know that a link is there?
They don't. So a link is a very specifically used property. So basically what a link means to me, so when you're talking about the web developers and accessibility experts will argue forever over what the definition of a link is. When you're talking about iOS, the reason the trait iOS link exists, in my opinion, is because phones, when you have a phone, when you have an application and you interact with a button, it's going to keep you within the context of your application, right? So when you're scrolling around and you tap a button, your application context doesn't change, your view doesn't change. Maybe you go to a different tab within your application, but you're still within the same package, right? A link is going to be the opposite thing. When you activate a link, you can have links that take you to things that aren't web pages. You can have like for example, it's becoming really popular to have auto links on like phone numbers, right? And so to me, what a link means within the context of a native application, within a mobile environment, is anything that you click that's going to take you outside of your application package's context and to something else, right? Because that is a very important change of context to communicate to the user. And so Apple did something really smart with that trait of link by allowing us to control it, right? Because by that definition, there are a lot of things in iOS that are links that don't have that quote link appearance, right? That don't have the underlined text, that don't have the http.www.whatever.com. There are a lot of controls within iOS that are going to do that behavior that I described, where they take you out of that application context. And that to me is what a link is in iOS, not your standard web definition of a link. And so for your standard web definition of a link, you got to add that property. You got to make things separately actionable and apply the trait link to them. That's the only real way to do it within a native iOS environment, is to get that link. And I mean, of course, you could say accessibility label, add the link to that. We've already discussed why adding role information to things is a bad idea, unless it's actually in the actual visible text. But the only real way to do it properly is to make sure that when that link is focused, when that thing that is actionable, that is going to take you out of the application's context, that thing needs to have the trait of link on it.
Great. So we're reaching the end of our time here. So we'll make sure to get to the rest of the questions, hopefully through email. You can email me, and I'll definitely loop in Chris to make sure we get all those answers questions. Thank you all for joining the webinar today. We'll be sending out the slides and the recorded version of this webinar to everyone within the next 24 hours, and I'll hand it over to Chris to wrap up.
I'm good. Thanks everybody for listening, and like I said, feel free to follow my blog videos and ask questions on Stack Overflow, and hopefully you all got something useful from this. But thanks for listening.